The manuscript you hold in your hands was delivered to me under circumstances both peculiar and sinister. It arrived in a crate of papers purchased at a country auction in a forgotten corner of Derbyshire, its binding cracked, its pages exuding the faint, sweet smell of decay and damp limestone. It purports to be the personal account of one Reverend Josiah Thorne, concerning his time in the isolated hamlet of Hopefield and his dealings with the final scion of its most prominent family, Alistair Gorman. I present it here, transcribed faithfully, with no alteration to its substance and only minor corrections to its spelling and punctuation for the sake of clarity. I make no claims as to its veracity. The village of Hopefield does not appear on any modern map, and records of a Gorman family or a Gormanmere Hall are frustratingly elusive. Yet, the tale possesses a chilling internal consistency, a weight of dreadful detail that begs the question: is this a work of morbid fiction, a warning spun from whole cloth? Or is it a genuine chronicle of a horror so profound that the very earth, and the annals of men, sought to erase it? You, dear reader, must be the final arbiter of its truth. Yours in solemn curiosity, J. M. Pembroke Hiffords. London, 1899. It was in the autumn of 1843 that I received the letter that would irrevocably alter the course of my life, and indeed, my understanding of the human soul. The missive was from a solicitor in Manchester, a Mr. Withersby, and it concerned the spiritual welfare of one Alistair Gorman, sole resident of Gormanmere Hall, Hopefield. The village of Hopefield, Mr. Withersby's brief directions informed me, lay nestled in a fold of the Pennines, accessible only by a narrow, winding track that seemed more suited to sheep than to carriage traffic. My journey there was a descent from the vibrant, smoke-choked industry of the world into a realm of primordial stillness. The colors of the landscape leached away, replaced by a palette of slate gray, peat brown, and the deep, bruised green of ancient pines. The air grew cold and heavy, tasting of wet stone and rotting leaves. When at last the driver, a sullen, taciturn man who had grown increasingly reluctant the closer we drew to our destination, deposited me and my single trunk at the edge of the village, I felt a profound sense of isolation. Hopefield was not so much a village as a clutch of stone cottages huddled together for warmth and protection against the encroaching moor and the looming, dark expanse of Gormanmere Lake. The water itself was a sheet of polished lead, its surface unruffled by wind, reflecting the brooding sky with a perfect, unsettling fidelity. At its far end, perched upon a rocky promontory that jutted into the black waters, stood Gormanmere Hall. It was a gaunt, grey edifice of Tudor origin, its windows like sightless eyes, its chimneys standing as stark as grave markers against the sky. The villagers were a breed apart from any I had previously encountered. Their greetings were muted, their eyes downcast. They possessed a watchful quality, as if they were perpetually waiting for some long-dreaded event. When I mentioned my purpose, to attend to Mr. Gorman at the Hall, a palpable chill fell upon the small group gathered outside the inn. An old woman, her face a web of wrinkles, made the sign of the cross and spat into the dirt. "You'll find no salvation there, Father," she muttered, before turning her back on me. It was the publican, a Mr. Hargrove, who provided me with a modicum of context, albeit reluctantly, over a pint of thin, sour ale in his near-empty taproom. "The Gormans," he said, wiping a tankard with a grimy cloth, "have been masters of this valley since time out of mind. But they've always been a queer lot. Kept to themselves. The current master, Alistair, he's the last of the line. His parents, old Mr. Septimus and Mrs. Gorman, passed some 10 years back. A terrible tragedy." "Illness?" I inquired. Hargrove's eyes darted towards the window and the distant hall. "Of a sort," he said evasively. "The story told is that Mr. Septimus, in a fit of melancholy, did violence to his wife and then turned the knife upon himself. They were found in the master bedroom. Alistair, he was but a lad of 16 then. He's lived up there alone ever since, except for an old housekeeper, Mrs. Rigby, who goes up by day. We see him not at all." The man's tone was carefully neutral, but the words hung in the air, thick with unspoken suspicion. A patricide and a matricide, even by a father's hand, casts a long and crooked shadow. I felt a tremor of unease. My charge was not merely a recluse, but a soul forged in the crucible of an unspeakable domestic horror. As dusk began to bleed into the moor, I made my way along the overgrown carriage drive that led to Gormanmere Hall. The air grew colder still, and from the depths of the mere, a thin, milky mist began to uncoil and creep towards the shore. It was then I heard it, a sound that seemed to have no place in God's creation. A low, guttural croaking, not from a single throat, but from a multitude. Peering through the gathering gloom, I saw them. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of enormous ravens, perched in the skeletal trees that lined the drive. They were utterly still, their jet-black eyes fixed upon me as I passed. Not one took flight. They merely watched in a silence more menacing than any cacophony. I arrived at the great oak door of the hall with a heart grown heavy with a dread I could not name. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rigby, a pinched and fearful woman, admitted me without a word and led me through a cavernous, dust-shrouded hall to the library. And there he was, Alistair Gorman. He stood before a cold fireplace, a man in his mid-20s, yet he carried the weary demeanor of one twice his age. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his black hair lank and unkempt. But it was his eyes that arrested me. They were the color of the mere on a sunless day, a flat, lightless gray, and they held an expression of such profound and weary cynicism that it felt like a physical blow. "Reverend Thorne," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that held no warmth. "So, you have come to shrive me? I fear you have undertaken a long journey for very little." "I have come," I replied, striving for a tone of gentle authority, "because I was summoned, and because it is never too late to seek God's grace." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "Grace," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign and unpleasant word. "We shall see. Mrs. Rigby will show you to your room. The mere, it sings at night. Do not be alarmed. It is only the wind in the reeds." But as I was led up the grand staircase, past portraits of stern-faced Gormans whose eyes seemed to follow my progress, I knew with a certainty that chilled my very soul that it was not the wind. And I knew, too, that Alistair Gorman was a man imprisoned not by stone and mortar, but by something far, far older, and infinitely more dark. My chamber was in the east wing of the hall, a vast, vaulted room that smelled of dust and desiccation. The four-poster bed, hung with faded tapestries depicting some forgotten hunt, seemed to swallow the meager light from the single candle Mrs. Rigby had left me. The wind had indeed risen, but it did not sing. It moaned. A low, constant threnody in the chimney, a sound that spoke of loss and endless, empty spaces. And beneath it, or perhaps woven through it, was another sound, a faint, wet susurrus that could indeed have been reeds, but which put me in mind of something whispering just beyond the thick, leaded glass of the window. Sleep was a fugitive that night. The portraits in the corridor outside, which I had to pass to reach my room, seemed to have impressed their grim visages upon the back of my eyelids. Each time I drifted towards oblivion, I would startle awake, convinced I had heard a footfall outside my door, or the soft, grating sound of a door easing shut elsewhere in that monstrous house. I was a man of God, trained to find solace in faith, but the atmosphere of Gormanmere Hall was a palpable weight, a miasma of sorrow and sin that seemed to resist all prayer. When a gray, watery dawn finally filtered through the windows, I rose, feeling more weary than when I had retired. I found my way to the small breakfast room where Mrs. Rigby had laid a sparse meal: cold ham, bread that was slightly stale, and a pot of bitter coffee. Alistair Gorman was not present. "He keeps his own hours, sir," Mrs. Rigby said when I inquired, her eyes fixed on the floor. "He often walks the mere by night and sleeps through the mornings." The death of his parents? I began, choosing my words with care. It must have been a terrible blow for one so young. The village seems deeply affected by it still. A spasm of something like fear crossed her pinched face. "We don't speak of it, Reverend. It's not spoken of. The mere, it takes what it's owed. That's all there is to it." Before I could press her further, she scurried from the room, leaving me with my unpalatable breakfast and a fresh crop of disquieting thoughts. It takes what it's owed. What pagan nonsense was this? This was precisely the kind of rustic superstition I had been sent to combat. Determined to be of some use, I resolved to explore the hall. It was a monument to decay. Room after room lay under Holland covers, the shapes of furniture beneath them like slumbering beasts. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that penetrated the grime on the windows. In the grand drawing room, a harpsichord stood with its lid open, the strings within rusted and snapped. The air was thick and still, and the only constant was the view from every window, the relentless, brooding presence of the mere. It was in the library where I had first met Gorman that I found the first tangible piece of the puzzle. Tucked behind a volume of sermons on a high shelf, as if hidden, was a small leather-bound sketchbook. Its pages were filled not with words, but with drawings. They were the work of a skilled, if troubled, hand. They depicted the mere again and again, from every conceivable angle. But in these sketches, the water was not empty. Strange, sinuous shapes coiled just beneath its surface, shapes that suggested immense, serpentine bodies or the tangled limbs of drowned things. In one, a figure stood on the shore, arms outstretched towards the water. It was unmistakably a younger Alistair. And from the water, a long, dark tendril seemed to be reaching for him. My blood ran cold. This was not the fancy of a healthy mind. This was obsession, a fixation with the very source of the valley's gloom. I slipped the book back into its hiding place, my heart hammering against my ribs. What had the solicitor's letter said? A melancholic disposition, perhaps a crisis of faith. This was something far darker. That evening, Alistair joined me for dinner. He was paler than the night before, if such a thing were possible, and his movements were listless. We ate in near silence, the clatter of cutlery on fine china echoing in the cavernous dining room. "You find our air invigorating, Reverend?" he asked at length, a trace of his former bitter smile playing about his lips. "I find it heavy, Mr. Gorman. There is a profound sadness here." "Sadness?" He gave a short, barking laugh that held no humor. "Is that what you call it? A simple, human sadness? How comforting that must be for you. To have a name for it. A box in which to place it, alongside your other theological curiosities." "What would you call it, then?" I asked, my voice steady despite my unease. His gray eyes met mine, and for a moment, the cynical mask slipped, and I saw a bottomless well of terror and despair. "I would call it hunger, Reverend. A deep, ancient, and patient hunger. This house, this land, it is not sad. It is empty, and emptiness always seeks to be filled." He would say no more on the subject. After the meal, he retired once more, leaving me alone with the ticking of a long case clock in the hall and the ever-present sound of the wind, or the reeds, or the whispering. That night, I was awakened not by a sound, but by a silence. The moaning wind had ceased. The house was preternaturally still. And in that silence, I heard it clearly. It was not a song. It was a voice. A low, murmuring, watery voice, seeming to come from the very walls themselves. I could not discern words, only a cadence, a sibilant, rhythmic chant that was both hypnotic and deeply, fundamentally wrong. I rose, my hand trembling as I lit my candle. I felt an irresistible, dread-filled urge to look from my window. The moon was full, bathing the landscape in a sickly, silver light. The mere was perfectly calm, a sheet of black glass. And there, on the shore, I saw him. Alistair. He stood at the water's edge, still as a statue, staring out into the center of the lake. And as I watched, I saw a ripple break the perfect surface, then another, moving against the non-existent current, converging towards the spot where he stood. The whispering in the walls seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I clapped my hands over my ears and stumbled back to my bed, where I remained, shivering and praying until the first light of dawn and the terrible, welcoming silence finally broke. The following day, I resolved to seek answers beyond the oppressive walls of Gormanmere Hall. If the house and its master would not yield their secrets, perhaps the village held a key, however rusted and grim. I found my way to the small, stone-built church of St. Bartholomew, which stood at the edge of the village, its graveyard sloping down towards the mere as if in a slow, gravitational surrender. The vicar, a man named Albright, was a surprise. Where I had expected a fellow soldier in Christ, perhaps worn down by his isolated parish, I found a man who was the very picture of robust, if simple, health. He was in his garden, tending to his leeks with a vigor that seemed almost offensive in that somber place. "Reverend Thorne." "A pleasure," he boomed, wiping his earth-stained hands on his trousers. "We get so few visitors." Come in, I'll have Mrs. Poole put the kettle on." His vicarage was warm, clean, and cheerfully mundane. It was a bastion of normalcy against the gloom outside. Over tea, I broached the subject carefully. "I am here at the behest of Mr. Gorman's solicitor," I explained. "He is concerned for the man's spiritual state." Reverend Albright's joviality dimmed. "Alistair. A tragic case." "A tragic case indeed. I have tried, of course. But he will not set foot in the church. Has not since the incident." "His parents?" I said. "The villagers seem fearful of the topic." Albright sighed, a long, weary sound. "They are a superstitious lot, Reverend. Their roots here are deep, far deeper than the foundation of this church. There are old beliefs, pagan beliefs, that cling to this valley like the mist to the mere. The housekeeper said something similar, that the mere takes what it is owed." A shadow passed over Albright's face. "That is their phrase for it. They believe the mere is a living thing, a god or a demon, and that the Gorman family are its stewards, its priests. In return for their position, the family is bound to it. The villagers believe that the mere demands a tithe, a sacrifice, from time to time. A lost sheep, a child." He lowered his voice. "They believe that what happened to Septimus and Eleanor Gorman was not a murder-suicide, but a payment, a settlement of a long-overdue debt." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "And what do you believe, Reverend?" "I believe in the power of our Lord Jesus Christ to banish all shadows," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He would not meet my eye. I believe that Septimus Gorman was a man plagued by his lineage, by the weight of this place. He was a scholar, obsessed with the local folklore. He spent years delving into it, collecting tales, studying the old ways. I fear it unhinged his mind. As for Alistair, the boy was found in the house with them for 3 days before they were discovered. 3 days, Reverend Thorne. What that did to his soul, only God can know. The image from the sketchbook, the tendril from the water reaching for the young Alistair, flashed in my mind. Had the father's obsession become the son's inheritance? I took my leave of Reverend Albright, my thoughts in a turmoil. His explanation, while gothic and horrifying, was at least rooted in human frailty, a man driven mad by superstition. It was a narrative I could grasp, a tragedy I could comprehend. But it did not explain the whispering in the walls. It did not explain the things I had seen from my window. On my way back to the hall, I passed through the heart of the village. A group of children were playing a silent, strange game by the edge of the green. They moved in a slow, circular pattern, their hands linked, their faces solemn. They were chanting, not in English, but in a low, guttural tongue that was alien to my ears. One of them, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 with hair the color of wheat and eyes that were far too old for her face, broke from the circle and walked towards me. She held out a small, damp object. It was a piece of water-smoothed shale, and on it, drawn in what looked like mud, was a crude but unmistakable symbol, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. "For the man in the dark house," she whispered. "The water is dreaming of him." Before I could respond, she turned and ran back to the others, who had stopped their game to watch with expressionless faces. I stood there, the cold, wet stone in my hand, the weight of the past pressing down upon me with the force of a physical blow. The Ouroboros, eternity, cycles, a hunger that never ends. The child's words echoed Albright's. It was not a song the mere sang. It was a dream, and Alistair Gorman was trapped within it. I stood frozen, the cold, damp shale a searing brand in my palm. The children had resumed their silent, circular dance, their strange chant once more a low undercurrent to the sighing wind. They paid me no further mind, as if their message had been delivered and their role was complete. I looked down at the stone. The Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, a symbol of eternity, of a cycle without beginning or end. The water is dreaming of him. The phrase was nonsensical, yet it resonated with a terrible, poetic truth that chilled me to my marrow. I slipped the stone into my waistcoat pocket, its presence a cold, accusing weight against my chest. My steps back to the hall were slow, burdened. The house seemed to watch my approach, its windows like the dull eyes of some great, slumbering beast. I found myself avoiding the main entrance, choosing instead a side door that led into the old conservatory, a place of skeletal plants and shattered glass, where the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. It was there that I came upon Alistair. He was not walking the mere, nor was he asleep. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the derelict room, his back to me, staring at a large, cracked terracotta pot from which spilled the rotten remains of some long-dead tropical plant. "They tried to cultivate beauty here once," he said, his voice quiet and conversational, though he did not turn. "My mother. She brought cuttings from the continent, had this glass house built. A futile attempt to keep the darkness at bay with color and life." He gestured vaguely at the dead foliage around us. "The mere does not tolerate such impertinence. It prefers its own palette. Green and black and gray." I moved to stand beside him. In the stark afternoon light, he looked gaunt, almost spectral. The shadows beneath his eyes were like bruises. "I have been to the village," I said. "I spoke with Reverend Albright." A flicker of a smile, devoid of warmth. "Ah, the good Reverend. Does he still preach of light while his leeks grow in the shadow of this place? He knows nothing. He tends his garden and pretends the rot is not in the soil itself. He told me of your father's studies." Alistair's gaze remained fixed on the dead plant. "My father was a fool. He thought he could understand it, that he could codify it, bind it in leather and ink. He collected every scrap of lore, every whispered tale from the oldest crone in the valley. He believed knowledge was a shield." He finally turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were hollow. "It is not a shield, Reverend. It is a key." And he unlocked a door that should have remained forever sealed. "What door, Alistair?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He ignored my question, his attention caught by something outside the grimy glass. "It is waking," he murmured. "The dream is deepening. Can you not feel it? The pressure. It is like being at the bottom of the sea." I followed his gaze. The mere lay inert, its surface unruffled. Yet I could feel it. A subtle, atmospheric shift, a thickening of the air that made it difficult to draw a full breath. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath with us. "The children," I said, compelled to fill the heavy silence. "A girl gave me this." I drew the shale from my pocket. The moment Alistair saw the symbol, his demeanor shattered. All pretense of calm detachment vanished, replaced by a raw, animal fear. He recoiled from the stone as if it were white-hot. "Where did you get that?" he hissed, his eyes wide. "Do not bring that filth into this house. It is their mark, the sign of the covenant." "What covenant, man? Speak plainly," I demanded, my own fear giving way to frustration. "The covenant my great-great-grandfather made. A bargain for the land, for the fish in the mere, for the ore in the hills. We were given dominion, but at a price. The line must be maintained. The tithe must be paid. My father, he thought he could break the chain. He refused the call. He and my mother," his words choked off. He wrapped his arms around himself, rocking slightly. The emptiness grew hungry. It demanded its due. He looked at me and I saw the truth of his existence. He was not a man haunted by the past. He was a man trapped by it, a caretaker of a terrible inherited debt. He was the next link in the chain, the next offering waiting upon the altar of the black water. "And you?" I asked, dreading the answer. "What is demanded of you?" A single, stark tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "To wait," he whispered. "To wait until the dream becomes real. And then, to walk into the water and never return." He turned and fled the conservatory, leaving me alone with the dead plants and the crushing weight of his confession. I looked from the stone in my hand to the dark waters beyond the glass. The Ouroboros. The cycle. The hunger that never ends. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that Alistair Gorman was not mad. He was a man living a nightmare that was, with every passing moment, becoming terrifyingly, tangibly real. The library of Gormanmere Hall was a mausoleum of forgotten knowledge, its air thick with the scent of old leather and crumbling paper. After my encounter in the conservatory, a desperate resolve took hold of me. If Alistair's damnation was written in ink and parchment, I would find it. I would understand the nature of the beast that held him in its thrall. I waited until the house was silent, save for the incessant ticking of the long case clock. Alistair had retreated to his chambers, and Mrs. Rigby had long since departed for the village. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, I began my search. I was no longer a guest, nor a spiritual advisor. I was a grave robber, desecrating a tomb of secrets. It was in a low, iron-bound chest tucked away in a shadowy alcove behind a tapestry that I found them. The journals of Septimus Gorman. Dozens of them, bound in the same dark leather, their pages filled with a tight, frantic script. I carried a stack to the large oak desk, the lamplight throwing monstrous, dancing shadows up the walls. The early volumes were the work of an antiquarian, dry and methodical. They detailed the history of Hopefield, land deeds, and notes on local flora and fauna. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted. The entries became less about observation and more about obsession. He began to transcribe the old tales, the ones Reverend Albright had so dismissively referred to as pagan beliefs. October 12, 1825. Spoke today with old Maggie Crowthorne by the mere. Her mind is mostly gone, but her tongue still holds the old words. She spoke of this sleeping lord, in the deep water, who was old when the first stones of this valley were laid. She called it, He Who Dreams the World. A fanciful name for a local superstition, yet the conviction in her milky eyes was unsettling. The entries grew darker. March 3, 1828. The pattern is undeniable. The parish records confirm it. Every third generation, a member of the Gorman line perishes in the mere. My own great-uncle, Alaric, vanished from his boat in 98. They found the boat, perfectly intact, adrift. No body was ever recovered. The villagers call it a tithe. A payment for continued prosperity. My rational mind rebels, yet the evidence is there, a bloody thread woven through our family history. I turned the page, my heart thudding dully in my chest. The script became more agitated, the ink blotted in places. July 17, 1833. I have found the original covenant. In a hidden compartment of my father's desk, a scroll of vellum, so old it crackled at my touch. The language is archaic, a bastard mix of Latin and something older, something guttural and foul. But the meaning is clear. It is a contract. Signed in 1672 by Josiah Gorman. In return for dominion over the valley and its riches, he pledged the line of his blood to the guardian of the deep. A life, every third generation, to be given freely to the waters. To walk into the dream and feed the sleeper. God in heaven, what have we done? The final journal was the thinnest, its covers stained as if by water. The entries were sparse, the handwriting a desperate scrawl. September 10, 1833. Eleanor fears for me. She says I have changed, that the house feels colder. She does not understand. The call is coming. I feel it in my bones, a low hum that is always there, just at the edge of hearing. It is in my dreams. Vast, dark shapes moving in the deep, and a voice that is not a voice, calling my name. October 29, 1833. It is not a superstition. It is real. I saw it last night. A shape in the mere, greater than any fish, greater than any beast of this earth. It looked at me. It knows I have read the words. It knows I have broken the seal of silence. The debt is due. The last entry was a single sentence, written in a shaking hand that was barely legible. The date was November 2, 1833. The day, I would later learn from the coroner's report Albright reluctantly showed me, that Septimus and Eleanor Gorman were found dead. It is promised it will take her instead if I do not come. I cannot. I will not go alone. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. The room spun. It was not a murder-suicide born of madness. It was a sacrifice. A terrified, broken man, faced with a horror beyond comprehension, who had chosen to offer his wife to the darkness in a frantic, futile attempt to save himself. And the darkness, it seemed, had not been appeased. It had simply waited for the next in line to ripen. I understood now the true source of Alistair's torment. He was not haunted by a tragic death. He was the heir to a monstrous bargain, a living tithe raised in the house where his father had condemned his mother to the black water. The whispers, the dreams, the feeling of being watched, it was not his imagination. It was the collector calling in the debt. The oil lamp guttered, plunging the room into near darkness. From the direction of the mere, I heard it again, the low, murmuring, watery voice. This time, I was almost certain I could discern a single repeated word, a name, spoken on the breath of the water and the wind. Alistair. A storm broke over Gormanmere that night, as if the heavens themselves sought to cleanse the valley of its sin. Wind howled like a banshee around the hall's gables, and rain lashed the windows in great, furious sheets. The house groaned and shuddered with each gust, a living entity in its agony. In the tumult, the whispering from the mere was drowned out, but a new sound took its place, the frantic, desperate pacing of Alistair Gorman in the room above mine. I could not remain in my chamber. The confession I had wrested from the dead father's journals screamed in my mind. I had to speak to the son. Armed with the terrible truth, I climbed the grand staircase, the wind tearing at the house like a thing possessed. I found him not in his room, but in the long gallery, a place lined with the portraits of his ancestors. He stood before the depiction of Josiah Gorman, the signatory of the covenant. The man in the painting was severe, with the same lightless gray eyes as Alistair, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. A single candle in Alistair's hand threw monstrous, leaping shadows that made the painted faces seem to writhe. "He looks pleased with himself, does he not?" Alistair said, his voice raw and strained over the storm's roar. "He bought us a fortune with a flick of his pen and damned his bloodline for eternity. A shrewd bargain." "Alistair," I said, my voice firm, "I have read your father's journals." He went very still, his back to me. The only movement was the frantic dance of the candle flame. "Then you know," he whispered. "You know what he did. I know he was a coward. I know he tried to offer your mother in his stead. But the debt was not paid. A life taken in fear and treachery is not a life given freely. The covenant demands a willing sacrifice, does it not?" He turned slowly. His face was a mask of torment, etched deep by the flickering light. Rain and tears mingled on his cheeks. "Yes, it must be given, not stolen in the night. My father, he did not just kill her. He broke the pact. He insulted the dreamer. And the hunger, it grew. It has been festering for 10 years, growing strong on his betrayal. It does not just want a life now, Reverend. It wants an apology. It wants me." "There must be another way," I implored, stepping closer. "We can leave this place. Tonight. We can flee this madness." A peal of thunder shook the very stones of the hall. In the sudden, brilliant flash of lightning that followed, I saw his expression clearly, a look of pitying despair. "Flee!" He gave a hollow laugh. "It is in my blood, Thorn. It is in my dreams. Do you think I have not tried? I went to London once, 5 years ago. The noise, the crowds, it was unbearable. And the whole time, the call was there, not in my ears, but in my soul. A dull, aching pull, like a fishhook lodged in my heart, drawing me back here. This is my world. This mere, this house, this darkness. There is no other." He gestured wildly at the portraits. They all knew. They all accepted their fate. They walked into the water when their time came, and the line continued. My father was the only one who rebelled. And for his rebellion, he delivered not only his own soul to damnation but mine to a far more terrible fate. I am not just a tithe. I am a penance. The candle in his hand guttered violently, and for a moment, we were plunged into near darkness. When it steadied, his eyes were wide with a fresh terror. "It is here," he breathed. The temperature in the gallery plummeted. The storm outside seemed to recede, replaced by a new sound, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a sound that was felt more than heard. It came from the mere. We rushed to a window. The rain was still falling, but the surface of the mere was no longer chaotic. It was swirling, a vast, slow, deliberate vortex opening up at its center. And from that black, spinning maw, a pale, phosphorescent green light began to emanate, illuminating the undersides of the low, scudding clouds. "It is waking," Alistair whispered, his breath fogging the cold glass. "The dream is ending. It is time." He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the resignation of a condemned man walking to the gallows. There was no fear left, only a weary, bottomless sorrow. "You must leave this place, Reverend," he said, his voice eerily calm. "When it is over, do not look back. There is nothing for you here but a memory that will poison your sleep for the rest of your days." Before I could respond, he turned and walked from the gallery, his footsteps echoing down the dark corridor towards the main staircase. He was going to the mere. I stood frozen, trapped between my duty to God, my terror of the unnatural, and a desperate, futile pity for the man descending into the storm. The thrumming from the lake grew louder, a monstrous heartbeat echoing through the valley. The vortex of light widened, and for a fleeting, horrifying instant, I thought I saw something vast and unnameable shift within the luminous depths. A force beyond reason, beyond faith, propelled me forward. I could not let him go alone. Snatching a heavy cloak from a stand in the hall, I plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at me, the rain needling my face like icy daggers. The world was a chaos of roaring blackness, broken only by the unearthly, pulsating green light emanating from the center of the mere. Alistair was a dark, stumbling silhouette ahead of me, moving with a dreadful purpose down the sloping lawn towards the water's edge. He did not run. He walked as a man to his own execution, his head bowed against the storm, yet his path was unwavering. The thrumming was a physical pressure now, a deep vibration that set my teeth on edge and made the very ground seem to tremble. The vortex in the lake swirled, a great, slow-moving whirlpool of black water fringed with that sickly luminescence. It did not look like water at all, but like a portal into some other, fouler element. "Alistair!" I cried out, my voice ripped away by the gale. "Stop! In the name of God, do not do this!" He either did not hear me or chose not to. He reached the rocky shore and without a moment's hesitation, stepped into the water. The black, icy liquid swallowed his boots, then his ankles, then his knees. He did not falter. Driven by a final, desperate surge of will, I scrambled down the bank, slipping on the wet stones, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the water's edge just as he was waist-deep. The scene before me is etched into my memory with the clarity of a nightmare. The green light from the vortex cast everything in a ghastly, submarine glow. Alistair was now chest-deep, his arms slightly outstretched. And then I saw them. The tendrils. They were not of solid matter, but seemed composed of the water itself, thick ropes of sentient, churning blackness, shot through with filaments of that same vile green light. They uncoiled from the depths, sliding smoothly, almost lovingly, around his arms, his torso, pulling him gently but inexorably towards the center. He turned his head then and looked back at me. There was no fear on his face. There was, God forgive me for saying it, a kind of peace. A final, terrible release from his long torment. His lips moved, and though I could hear nothing over the storm and the thrumming, I knew the words he formed. "It is done." The tendrils tightened. In an instant, they pulled him under. There was no struggle, no splash. One moment he was there, a man in a ghastly spotlight, and the next, the black waters had closed over his head. The green light in the vortex flared with an impossible, blinding intensity, so bright I had to shield my eyes. A sound like a great, shuddering sigh passed through the valley, a wave of palpable relief that seemed to emanate from the very earth and stones. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The vortex collapsed. The thrumming ceased. The storm, as if its purpose was also served, began to abate. The wind softened to a mournful whisper. The rain became a gentle drizzle. The mere was once again a sheet of flat, black, undisturbed water. I stood there, soaked and shivering, staring at the spot where Alistair Gorman had been consumed. The world had returned to normal, but it was a normalcy more horrifying than the preceding supernatural display. It was the calm of a sated beast. The tithe had been paid. The covenant was fulfilled. I do not know how long I remained there. Eventually, a sliver of moon broke through the ragged clouds, casting a feeble silver light upon the scene. The mere looked innocent, a simple lake in a lonely valley. There was no evidence of the horror that had just transpired. No ripple, no bubble, no trace. Slowly, mechanically, I turned and walked back towards Gormanmere Hall. It stood silent and dark, a great, empty skull upon the hill. It was no longer a house of shadows and whispers. It was just a house. The presence that had filled it, the dreaming hunger from the lake, was gone. For now. I knew then that Alistair was right. There was nothing for me here but a poisoned memory. I would leave at first light. But as I trudged up the lawn, a final, chilling thought occurred to me, a thought that has haunted me every day since. The covenant demanded a life every third generation. Alistair was the last of his line. There were no more Gormans. When the debt next fell due, in 60 or 70 years, who, or what, would the dreaming hunger in the black waters of Hopefield come to collect? The dawn that broke over Hopefield was one of unnerving perfection. The sky was a clear, untroubled blue, the air washed clean and crisp. Birds sang in the woods, their melodies sharp and cheerful. The mere lay placid, reflecting the serene heavens, its dark waters holding their secret with an absolute, indifferent silence. The horror of the night before felt like a fever dream, a phantom of the storm, but the mud caking my boots and the bone-deep chill in my soul were testaments to its dreadful reality. I packed my few belongings with a haste that bordered on frenzy. The silence of Gormanmere Hall was now more oppressive than its previous whispers. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of my own clothing, seemed an intrusion upon a profound and terrible peace. The house was empty in a way that went beyond the mere absence of people. It felt voided, its malignant soul having departed with the last of its masters. I did not wait for Mrs. Rigby. I could not bear to see her knowing, fearful eyes, to answer the questions she would not dare to ask. I simply left, striding down the carriage drive as if the hounds of hell were at my heels. The ravens were gone. The trees stood bare and quiet. In the village, a subtle change had taken place. It was not jubilant, nor was it mournful. It was a shift in atmosphere, like the release of a long-held breath. The people I passed did not meet my eye, but their postures were less hunched, their movements less furtive. They went about their morning chores with a quiet normalcy that was, in its own way, more chilling than their previous superstitious dread. They knew. They may not have known the specifics, but they felt the lifting of the weight, the sating of the ancient hunger. The tithe had been paid and the valley was safe. For now. I went directly to the inn and requested that the sullen driver take me back to Manchester immediately. He grunted an assent, his eyes flickering towards the hall and then away, a look of grim understanding on his face. There would be no questions from him either. As the carriage pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of St. Bartholomew's Church. Reverend Albright was standing at the lych gate, watching my departure. He did not wave. He simply stood there, a solid, mundane figure in his black coat, his face an unreadable mask. He was the shepherd of this flock, a flock that worshipped his God on Sunday and placated a older, darker one the rest of the week. He would remain, tending his garden, preaching his sermons and waiting as they all would for the slow, patient turning of the generational wheel. The journey out of the valley was the reverse of my arrival, an ascent from a world of primordial stillness into one of bustling human industry. But the colors of the outside world seemed garish to me now, its noises hollow and meaningless. I carried the gray palette of Hopefield within me, the image of the black water and the green light seared onto my vision. I sit now in my modest study in a quiet corner of Lancashire, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my faith and my books. The fire crackles cheerfully in the grate, and the rain against the window is but ordinary rain. I have tried to resume my life, to bury the memory of those few days in the valley of Hopefield beneath a mountain of prayer and pastoral duty. But I cannot escape it. In the quiet of the night, I sometimes start from sleep, my ears straining, convinced I have heard the faint, sibilant whisper of the mere calling from a great distance. I see the portraits in the long gallery, their stern faces watching me. And I see him most clearly of all, Alistair Gorman, turning in the churning, phosphorescent water, his face a mask of tragic peace as the darkness took him. I have made discreet inquiries. There is no record of an Alistair Gorman of Gormanmere Hall. The solicitor, Withersby, of whom I could find no trace, has vanished as completely as the man who summoned me. The village of Hopefield does not appear on any map I have since consulted. It is as if the entire affair has been expunged from the world, a story too terrible to be remembered. And so I am left with this record. I set it down not for absolution, for I fear there is none to be had for one who has witnessed what I have and done nothing. I set it down as a warning and as a testament. A warning to any who might stumble upon a secluded valley where the water is black and the air is heavy with waiting. And a testament to Alistair Gorman, the last son of a damned line, who walked into a nightmare to pay a debt that was not his own. Was it real? Or was it a phantasm, an elaborate delusion born of isolation and suggestion? I look at my own hand, the hand that held the damp shale with the Ouroboros, the hand that turned the pages of Septimus Gorman's frantic journals. I feel the chill that has never quite left my bones. I know what I believe. The world is older and darker than our philosophies allow. There are places where the fabric of God's creation is thin, and other, hungrier things press close. And in the silent, black depths of certain forgotten waters, something ancient dreams, and waits for its due. Months have bled into a year since my return from that accursed valley, yet Hopefield holds me still in its clammy grasp. My sermons, once a source of solace and strength for my congregation, now feel like hollow recitations. I speak of divine light, but my mind is filled with images of a subterranean glow. I talk of salvation, while the memory of a man walking willingly to his damnation screams silently in my ears. The faith that was the bedrock of my life now feels like a child's paper shield against a raging tempest. Sleep, when it comes, is no respite. My dreams are not of the event itself, but of the aftermath. I am standing on the shore of the mere, but the water is clear as glass, and I can see all the way to the bottom. There, on a bed of pale silt, lie the Gormans, Josiah with his cruel smile, Septimus and Eleanor locked in a frozen embrace of terror, and Alistair, his eyes open, staring up at me. They do not decay. They are preserved, like specimens in a jar, and their lips move in unison, forming the same silent, water-choked word, soon. I have taken to long, aimless walks, hoping the physical exertion will quiet my mind. It was on one such walk, through a neighboring parish I did not know well, that I saw her. A girl of perhaps 7 or 8, with hair the color of wheat. She was alone, skipping stones across a placid farm pond. She turned, and her eyes, old and knowing, met mine. It was the same girl from the village green in Hopefield. A smile, faint and utterly devoid of childish innocence, touched her lips before she turned and vanished into a copse of trees. I stood transfixed, a cold sweat beading on my brow. It was impossible. A trick of the mind, a mere resemblance. Yet the certainty was absolute. She was a sentinel, a reminder that the influence of that place was not confined to its geographical boundaries. The Covenant, it seemed, had watchers. This apparition, real or imagined, shattered what little piece I had cobbled together. I became consumed by a need for proof, for some tangible evidence that I was not descending into madness. I began to scour county archives, old land deeds, and forgotten genealogies, searching for any fragment that would corroborate my story. The name, Gorman, yielded nothing. Hopefield was a ghost. But in a mildewed ledger detailing the transfer of mineral rights in the broader Pennine region for the year 1672, I found a curious entry. It was a bill of sale for a tract of land listed only as the Black Lake Valley, sold by the Crown to one J. Gorman, For a sum so paltry it was laughable. The signature was a frantic, spidery scrawl. And beside it, as a witness, was a symbol, drawn not written, a coiled serpent, eating its own tail. My hands trembled as I traced the faded ink with my finger. J. Gorman. A misspelling? A deliberate obfuscation? It did not matter. Here, in the dry, bureaucratic record of a 3-century-old transaction, was the echo of the horror. The covenant had a receipt. Armed with this fragile thread, I sought out an old university acquaintance, a historian and cartographer named Dr. Hemingway, a man of staunch rationality and little patience for superstition. I showed him the ledger, asking if he knew of the location. He peered at it through his spectacles, his brow furrowed. The Black Lake Valley, a common enough description. But the price, peculiar. He spent an afternoon buried in his maps. Finally, he called me over, pointing to a large, detailed ordnance survey map from 1805. "Look here," he said, his finger resting on a remote fold of the hills. There was a small, unnamed body of water. No roads led to it. No settlements were marked nearby. But etched in tiny, almost invisible letters along its shore was a name I had never thought to see in any official record: Gorman Mere. "It's a cartographer's notation," Hemingway said, shrugging. "Probably named for some long-dead local family. The place is utterly inaccessible. Why the interest, Thorne? You look as though you've seen a ghost." I could not answer. I was staring at the map, at the proof that the place existed, that the family had given their name to the water that had consumed them. The valley was real. The mere was real. And if the stage was real, then the play that had been enacted upon it must be real as well. I left Hemingway's study in a daze, the map burning a hole in my mind. The proof I had sought now felt like a sentence. I had not found solace in confirmation. I had only anchored my nightmare to the bedrock of reality. The whispers were not in my head. The girl was not a phantasm. The debt was real, and Alistair had paid it. But as I walked the crowded streets back to my lodgings, a new and more terrifying thought began to take shape, born from the final, chilling realization I had on the shore. The line was broken. The Gormans were no more. Who would the Mere dream of now? The confirmation of the Mere's existence did not bring the closure I so desperately sought. Instead, it acted as a key, unlocking a deeper, more pervasive dread. The horror was not confined to a forgotten valley. It was a stain upon creation itself, and I, by virtue of my witness, was now part of its pattern. Dr. Hemingway's rational dismissal of the place as inaccessible and of no consequence rang hollow in my ears. It was not inaccessible to the thing that dwelled within it. Its consequence was measured in souls. I withdrew further from my duties, pleading a lingering ague. My congregation, good and simple folk, sent soups and well-wishes, their kindness a sharp reproach to the darkness festering in my heart. I could not offer them spiritual guidance, for my own spirit felt tainted, a vessel that had been filled with black water and then emptied, forever retaining its chill. It was during this period of self-imposed isolation that the dreams shifted once more. No longer was I a passive observer on the shore. Now I was in the water. The cold was a physical agony, 1,000 needles of ice piercing my skin. The green, phosphorescent light pulsed around me, not illuminating the depths but revealing the immense, shadowy forms that moved within them, forms that were less substance than suggestion, vast coils of ancient malice and patient hunger. I felt a profound, psychic pull, a call that was not a sound but a compulsion, drawing me down towards the source of the light. And always, just before I woke gasping and drenched in a cold sweat, I would see Alistair. But he was not looking at me. He was looking past me, his expression one of pity, and his hand would point upwards, towards the surface I could never reach. The meaning was clear. I was not the tithe, but I had been marked by my proximity to it. The dreamer in the deep had tasted my fear, had felt my presence at the moment of feeding, and a fragment of its attention now rested upon me. Driven by a need to understand the nature of the thing that haunted me, I returned to the only source I had, the memory of Septimus Gorman's journals. I spent days in my study, scrawling down every recalled phrase, every fragment of the covenant I could remember. He who dreams the world. The guardian of the deep. To walk into the dream and feed the sleeper. The language was not that of a simple water spirit or a local demon. It spoke of something cosmological, an entity whose slumber was somehow tied to the fabric of reality in that place. It did not merely live in the mirror. The mirror was a part of it, a sensory organ, a mouth. The sacrifices were not just appeasement, they were sustenance for its endless dream. And then I remembered the children, their silent dance, their chant in that guttural tongue. They were not merely superstitious villagers. They were a priesthood, a lineage of watchers who had maintained the old ways long after their meaning had been forgotten by others. They knew the rituals, the signs. The girl with the wheat-colored hair had not just given me a stone, she had given me a warning and perhaps a key. The Ouroboros. The serpent eating its own tail. Eternity. A cycle without end. But Alistair had ended the cycle. He was the last. Us. A new and abominable thought, more terrible than any that had preceded it, began to take root in my mind. It was a thought I had resisted, a connection my soul recoiled from making. I thought of the Gorman portraits, the lightless gray eyes that were Alistair's eyes. I thought of my own reflection, which I had avoided for months. My own eyes, a common brown, now seemed to hold a new depth in certain lights, a fleck of flat, gray emptiness when I caught them unawares. It was a trick of the mind, a fancy born of exhaustion and terror. It had to be. But the thought would not be silenced. It whispered to me in the quiet hours, a serpent coiling in the dark of my psyche. The covenant was a chain of blood. A lineage. The Gormans were gone. But what of the man who had witnessed its final enactment? The man whose soul had been in the room, so to speak, when the last will and testament of that damned line was fulfilled? What if the hunger, finding its traditional vessel empty, had begun to dream of a new one? What if the echo of the curse could resonate in the blood of the witness? I rose from my desk and went to the window. The night was clear, the moon bright. At the far end of my garden, the land dipped into a small, willow-ringed pond. It was a tranquil scene, one I had always found comforting. Tonight, however, the water of the pond was preternaturally still. And as I watched, a single, slow ripple moved across its surface, from the center outwards, against the gentle night breeze. A shape, dark and indistinct, seemed to shift just beneath the moon's reflection. It was happening again. Not in Hopefield. The call was no longer a distant whisper from a forgotten valley. It was here, in my own garden, in the quiet of my own mind. The Blackwaters were not a place. They were a state of being, and I was beginning to drown in them. The world outside my window had become a pale imitation of itself, a watercolor sketch washed thin and gray. The vibrant greens of the lawn, the cheerful hues of the flower beds, all seemed muted, drained of their essence, as if the color was leaching from my own perception. The only thing that held any vividness, any terrible potency, was the water. The pond at the bottom of my garden was no longer a feature of the landscape. It was the landscape. Everything else was mere framing. The single, anomalous ripple I had witnessed became a regular occurrence. Each evening, as dusk began to bleed into night, the pond would grow perfectly still, a black disk set into the earth. Then the ripples would begin, not from the wind, but from within, slow, concentric circles that spread with a languid, purposeful rhythm. I took to standing at my study window for hours, watching, my forehead pressed against the cold glass, a prisoner awaiting a summons. The compulsion grew stronger, a physical pull in my core, a lodestone drawing me towards the water. I stopped eating. My prayers became rote whispers, the words ash in my mouth. My parishioners' concerned faces became blurred, their voices distant echoes. They saw a man wasting away from a mysterious illness. They did not see the hooks of an ancient hunger buried deep in his soul. One night, the call became unbearable. It was a voice not in my ears, but in my bones, a low, resonant hum that was the very antithesis of sound. It was the thrumming of the mere, but now it was here, vibrating up from the ground through the foundations of my house. The green light did not appear in my pond, but I could see it when I closed my eyes, a pulsating, sickly glow at the edge of my vision, a permanent afterimage of damnation. I found myself moving through my dark house, a sleepwalker. I did not will my legs to carry me, they acted of their own accord. I opened the back door and stepped out into the chill night air. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through my stockings, but I felt nothing. The only sensation was the pull, growing stronger with every step I took towards the pond. The rational part of my mind, the part that was still Reverend Josiah Thorne, screamed in silent terror. This was madness. This was the end. I was walking the same path as Alistair Gorman, not out of a resigned duty to a covenant, but as a fly drawn to a carnivorous plant. I had looked into the abyss, and now it was calling me home. I reached the water's edge. The black surface was like polished obsidian, reflecting the bloated, gibbous moon. The ripples had ceased. It was waiting. The thrumming was a physical pressure in my skull, a demand. I looked down into the water, and for a moment, I saw my own reflection, a gaunt, haunted specter with sunken eyes. Then the reflection shifted, twisted. It was no longer my face. It was Alistair's, his expression still peaceful, but his eyes held a profound and sorrowful warning. Behind him, in the impossible depths of my small garden pond, vast, coiling shadows moved. My body leaned forward. A part of me wanted it. Wanted the silence, the end of the struggle, the release from the constant, gnawing fear. To walk into the dream and let it all be over. But as my weight began to shift onto my front foot, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear amidst the psychic static. It was the girl on the village green, pressing the stone into my hand. The water is dreaming of him. And then Alistair's final, desperate warning to me, "You must leave this place. There is nothing for you here but a memory that will poison your sleep for the rest of your days." He had not said the memory would kill me. He had said it would poison me. This was the poison. This compulsion, this haunting. The thing in the water did not need to claim my body. It was content to claim my mind, to make me its own, a living monument to its power, a new kind of tithe, a soul driven to madness and self-destruction. With a gasp that tore at my throat, I wrenched myself backward, stumbling and falling onto the damp grass. I scrambled away from the water on my hands and knees, like an animal, until my back hit the rough bark of a willow tree. I sat there, trembling violently, sobbing with a raw, primal relief. The thrumming ceased. The compulsion vanished, leaving behind only a hollow, aching weakness. The pond was just a pond again. I had resisted. I had broken the spell, for now. But as I sat there in the dark, the cold truth settled over me. This was not a victory. It was a temporary stay of execution. The connection was forged. The dreamer had tasted my will and found it wanting. It knew I was vulnerable. It knew I was afraid. I could not stay here. This house, this life, was no longer a sanctuary. It was the next best thing to the shores of Gormanmere. The black waters had found a new vessel to haunt, and I was drowning on dry land. I had to flee, not from a place, but from the memory itself. But as I gathered the strength to stand, a terrible question echoed in the newfound silence of my mind. Where does one run when the horror is not behind you, but within? It was the only imperative that remained, a base instinct that overrode both clerical duty and rational thought. I could not remain in my parsonage, a sitting duck awaiting the next, perhaps irresistible, summons from the water. As the first gray light of dawn stained the sky, I was already packing a valise with a few essentials, some clothes, a Bible I no longer found comfort in, and the journal in which I had begun this grim account. I left a vague note for the churchwardens, citing a pressing family matter requiring my immediate and indefinite attention. It was a lie, but the truth would have seen me confined to an asylum. I took a public coach to the nearest rail terminus, the clatter of the wheels and the shriek of the steam whistle a welcome assault on my senses. I needed noise, industry, the thrum of man, not of monster. I bought a ticket for London, the greatest city in the world, a teeming anthill where a man could lose himself utterly. For a few days it seemed to work. The sheer scale of the metropolis was overwhelming. The endless streets, the cacophony of traffic, the press of humanity. It formed a chaotic shield against the quiet, insidious pull of the mere. I took a room in a cheap boarding house near the docks, the air thick with the smells of tar, salt, and foreign spices. I walked until my feet blistered, trying to exhaust myself into a dreamless sleep. But the memory was a parasite that had burrowed too deep. The crowds did not make me feel anonymous. They made me feel alone, a single corrupted soul moving through a multitude of the blissfully ignorant. The noise was not a shield but a dissonant orchestra that could not mask the one constant note that hummed in the core of my being. And the water was everywhere. The Thames, a great, sluggish serpent winding through the city, its surface oily and reflecting the coal-smudged sky. Puddles in the cobblestone streets after a rain, each one a potential black mirror. The drip of a leaky tap in my room, a maddening rhythmic torture. One evening, seeking solace in a crowded pub, I saw him. Alistair. He was sitting in a shadowed corner, wearing the clothes of a dock worker, a tankard of ale untouched before him. His head was bowed, but as I stared, transfixed, he lifted it and met my gaze. Those same lightless gray eyes, filled with that same weary sorrow. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head, then faded back into the shadows until there was nothing there but an empty bench. I stumbled out into the street, my heart hammering. A hallucination, surely. A manifestation of my guilt and fear. But it felt more real than the solid brick of the buildings around me. It was a message. I could not outrun this. The connection was not geographical, it was spiritual. I was a thread tied to a sinking stone, and no matter how far I ran, the pull remained. Desperate, I sought refuge in the one place I thought might offer sanctuary, St. Paul's Cathedral. I walked through its great doors and stood in the vast, echoing space, my head thrown back to look up into the magnificent dome. I knelt before the altar, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. I prayed, not with the polished words of a clergyman, but with the raw, desperate pleas of a terrified man. Lord, deliver me from this evil. Shield me from this darkness. In the name of thy Son, our Savior, I beg you, break this chain. Silence. The grand cathedral was utterly silent. The prayers of the other worshippers, the shuffling of feet, the distant chant of a service, it all receded into a muffled haze. The only sound was the familiar, low thrumming, emanating not from the ground, but from the very air around me. I looked up at the great dome, and for a terrifying instant, the carved saints and angels seemed to writhe, their stone faces contorting into the visages of drowned things. The light filtering through the windows took on a sickly, greenish tinge. There was no sanctuary here. My faith was a house built on sand, and the black waters were rising. The entity, the dreamer, was not some localized demon to be banished by holy water and scripture. It was something older, something that treated the symbols of my God as mere curiosities. My prayers were not answered because they did not even register. I was screaming into a void that was infinitely older and emptier than the one I invoked. I fled the cathedral, a failure in the house of my own God. I walked aimlessly through the labyrinthine streets, a ghost among the living. The compulsion to find water returned, stronger now, a physical thirst that no amount of drink could quench. I found myself on the banks of the Thames, staring into its turbid, flowing depths. The call was here to... It was in all water. It was the water. The flight was over. I had run to the ends of my world and found it waiting for me. There was nowhere left to go. The realization was not one of despair, but of a bleak, horrifying acceptance. This was my life now. This watching, this waiting, this resisting a pull that would one day, inevitably, grow too strong to fight. I am back in my parsonage as I write this. The pond at the bottom of the garden is still. For now. I have returned not because I am safe, but because there is no safer place. The horror is not in Hopefield. It is in me. And so I remain, a keeper of a terrible secret, a sentinel at my own soul's gate, waiting for the day the dream deepens and the black waters finally claim their witness. The return to my parish was met with quiet concern and muted gossip. I had aged a decade in a matter of months. My frame, once robust, was now gaunt. My eyes, once clear, were shadowed pits. I offered no explanations, and my flock, in their inherent decency, ceased to ask. They saw a man broken by a private grief, and they respected the borders of that sorrow. Little did they know the borders were not of grief, but of a siege. I no longer tend the garden. The pond has been fenced off with rough-hewn timber, a futile barricade against an enemy that needs no physical passage. Mrs. Dobbins, my housekeeper, brings my meals and leaves them outside my study door, her kind face etched with worry. She believes I work on a grand theological treatise. In a way, I suppose I am. This journal has become my confession, my ledger, and my anchor to sanity. The act of setting down the words, of imposing narrative order upon the chaos I witnessed, is the only ritual that holds any meaning for me now. My Bible sits on the shelf, a closed book. Its promises feel meant for another world, a brighter creation untouched by the dreaming hunger in the deep. My prayers are silent, desperate clenches of the will against the constant, low-grade pull that emanates from any still body of water. I have become a scholar of my own damnation. I spend my days cross-referencing my memories of Septimus Gorman's journals with every obscure text of folklore and natural philosophy I can acquire. I search for a precedent, a name, a weakness. I find only echoes. Tales of water horses that drag children into locks, of grindylows in stagnant pools, of river gods demanding tribute. They are all childish fables when compared to the vast, cosmic apathy of he who dreams the world. This thing is no localized spirit. It is a cancer in the fabric of reality, and Hopefield was merely a tumor that had broken the skin. The compulsion comes in waves. Some days, it is a distant murmur, a background unease I can almost ignore. On others, it is a screaming in my blood, a physical agony of resistance that leaves me trembling and spent by nightfall. I see the girl with the wheat-colored hair sometimes, standing at the edge of the churchyard. She never ages. She only watches, her old eyes knowing. She is a living reminder that the covenant has watchers, and that I am now part of their vigil. I understand my role now. Alistair was the tithe. I am the witness. But a witness is not a passive observer. By seeing, by knowing, I have become a part of the story. The narrative requires a keeper, a recorder. Perhaps that is the true nature of the curse, not just the payment, but the memory of the payment, passed like a poison torch to ensure the horror is never truly forgotten. I do not know if the mere will ever call another tithe. The Gorman line is extinct. But the hunger remains. Perhaps it will sleep for a century, its appetite sated by Alistair's sacrifice. Perhaps it will seek a new family to bind to its service. Or perhaps it has already found what it needs, a lonely, broken clergyman, chained to the memory of its power, ensuring that the legend of the black waters of Hopefield does not fade into obscurity. This is my purpose now. To remember. To write. To stand guard against the forgetting. For if the world forgets, if the warning fades, then when the hunger wakes again, it will find a world unprepared, a flock of innocents ready for the slaughter. So I remain here, in my study, the keeper of the gate. The ink on this page is my bulwark. The words are my weapons. And when I feel the pull, when the thrumming starts in the foundations of the house and the still water in my washbasin seems to gaze back at me with a sentient hunger, I pick up my pen. I write. I bear witness. And I wait for the end of my watch, knowing that no one will come to relieve me. The air in my study has grown thick and heavy, tasting of peat and deep, still water. The familiar walls of my parsonage seem insubstantial, a painted backdrop trembling against a reality that is pushing through. The thrumming is no longer a sound one hears. It is the fundamental vibration of my existence, a resonance that has replaced the beating of my own heart. The fence around the pond collapsed 3 days ago. I did not build it back. There is no point. The compulsion is a constant now, a sweet, terrible melody that sings in my veins. It is not a command, but an invitation. An offer of an end to the struggle, to the endless, wearying vigil. To the silence that is filled with whispers. The memory of Alistair's peaceful face as he was taken haunts me more than the horror that preceded it. He found rest. I have found only a protracted, waking torment. I have packed a small bag. It contains only this journal, a pen, and a change of clothes. I do not know why I bother with the latter. I am going back. To Hopefield. To Gormanmere. The thought, which once would have filled me with paralyzing terror, now brings a profound, unsettling calm. This is not a surrender born of defeat, but an acceptance of an inevitable conclusion. The story began there. It must end there. I am not the tithe. I know that. The covenant does not demand me. But I am a loose thread, a witness who has seen too much and has been broken by the seeing. The narrative requires a final period. I have come to believe that my presence here, my knowing, is a form of static in the dream of the sleeper. By returning to the source, I can silence the interference. I can close the book. Mrs. Dobbins found me this morning, standing at the study window, staring out at the pond. "You look more yourself today, Reverend," she said, a note of hopeful relief in her voice. I turned to her and smiled. It was not a forced expression. For the first time in a year, my smile was genuine. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbins. I believe I have found the path forward." She did not understand. She saw peace where there was only conclusion. I will post this journal to my solicitor in Manchester with strict instructions that it is not to be opened for 50 years. Let the world forget Hopefield for a little while longer. Let them have their peace before this account poisons it. The journey will be long. I will take a coach, then a train, then another coach. I will walk the final miles as I did once before. But this time, I will not be a reluctant guest answering a summons. I will be a pilgrim returning to the shrine of his own undoing. I do not know what I will find there. An empty hall, crumbling into the peat. A village that has forgotten the name Gorman. Or perhaps, the same watchful silence, the same ancient hunger, waiting. It does not matter. The Blackwaters are calling. Not with a shout, but with a whisper that has become the only truth I know. They are not dreaming of me. They are dreaming, and I am finally ready to listen. This is the end of my account. The keeper is leaving his post. The story is complete. Reverend Josiah Thorne. October 31st, 1844. The manuscript ends there. The final entry is dated October 31st, 1844. There is no record of a Reverend Josiah Thorne in any ecclesiastical directory for that period, nor any mention of his fate in the newspapers of the day. He vanished as completely as the Gormans before him. The package containing these papers arrived at my offices precisely 50 years to the day after it was posted, as per the instructions to the solicitor's firm, which itself had long since been dissolved and its records lost. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed in a frantic, spidery hand, and it smelled faintly of damp and decay. I have presented the narrative as I found it, with only the most minor edits for clarity. I make no claims as to its veracity. Was Josiah Thorne a man driven mad by isolation and overactive imagination, his story a fabrication woven from local folklore and personal despair? Or did he indeed stumble upon a horror so profound that it cost him his sanity, his faith, and ultimately his life? I have, out of a sense of duty to the author, attempted to locate Hopefield. On a modern ordnance survey map, in the remote fold of the Pennines described by Thorne, there is a feature named Gorman Tarn. Tarn is a local word for a small mountain lake. No roads lead to it. The surrounding area is designated as a Ministry of Defense training range and is permanently closed to the public. The nearest village is called Hope Cross, a hamlet of 24 houses, whose inhabitants are notoriously taciturn with outsiders. I traveled there last summer. I did not attempt to reach the Tarn, deterred by both the law and a growing, personal sense of unease. But from a high ridge, miles distant, I saw it through a powerful glass, a small, dark sheet of water nestled in a barren bowl of land. It was a calm, sunny day, but the surface of the Tarn was perfectly, unnaturally still. No birds flew over it, and as I watched, I felt a distinct, irrational chill, a feeling of being observed by something ancient and utterly indifferent. I left Hope Cross that same day and have not returned. The reader must decide for themselves what to believe. Is this the genuine account of a forgotten tragedy, a warning from a lost century? Or is it merely a masterfully crafted work of Gothic fiction, a ghost story that has, over time, begun to believe its own haunting? I confess I do not know. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I find myself looking out of my window at the rain-slicked streets, and I think of a dark, still tarn in the northern hills. And I wonder if Josiah Thorne finally found the silence he was looking for, or if he simply became another part of the dream. J.M. Pembroke, London, 1899.